Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about the second most important element in learning Japanese, and that is vocabulary. And we're going to talk about a number of things, including how we can use the concepts of input and output to make our vocabulary learning much faster and more efficient. Vocabulary is the biggest single learning element in learning Japanese or any language, but particularly Japanese, because unlike languages related to our own, we don't have a large proportion of the vocabulary closely related to equivalent vocabulary in our own language. This makes it an even bigger task, but we can cut down that task considerably if we take a rational, organic approach to it. The conventional approach to learning vocabulary, which actually works somewhat better with related languages than it does with unrelated languages, although I don't think it's a wonderful strategy at any time, really misrepresents the process that happens when we learn vocabulary. It does this because it misunderstands what it really means to learn a word. I recently wrote a post on Patreon called Why Japanese to English Dictionaries Are Full of Baloney. Now, that was a somewhat provocative title and perhaps a bit unfair because dictionaries only do what they're supposed to do, which is give brief definitions of Japanese words in English. They're not supposed to be writing 12-page essays on words. The problem is that in most cases, Japanese words don't actually correspond directly to English words. In the case of very simple nouns, they do. Tree, water, house, pencil, hand, foot correspond pretty much exactly. Well, as a matter of fact, foot doesn't. There isn't a word in Japanese that corresponds exactly to the English word foot. But most of the time, these simple nouns have exact equivalents. As soon as we get into anything even a little bit abstract, exact correspondences become pretty rare. Even the words up and down don't correspond to any words in Japanese. Up and down are prepositions, and there are no prepositions in Japanese. Ue and shita are nouns, and they work differently from up and down in English. Now, once we get into subtler areas, like, say, the word interesting, we encounter a phenomenon which we're going to find in the majority of Japanese words, and that is that words in any language cover a particular area of the meaning spectrum, and it's relatively rare for a Japanese word to cover the exact same area of the meaning spectrum as an English word. Now, this shouldn't be a cause for panic, because in fact it's going to work in our favor. But first of all, let me explain what I mean. Let's take the word omoshiroi, which is usually defined as interesting. Now, the truth is that the word interesting and the word omoshiroi don't cover the same area of the meaning spectrum. At one end, omoshiroi shades into areas of the meaning spectrum that in English are covered by amusing and words of that sort. On the other side, the word interesting shades into areas that are covered not by the Japanese word omoshiroi, but by the Japanese word kyomibukai. And even this is oversimplifying the matter a little. So the idea that words can be translated, that they have exact equivalents in other languages, is something of a myth, especially when we're talking about unrelated languages like Japanese. Now, one of my patrons said that he found this very discouraging because he was spending a lot of time learning words, and then here was I saying that what he was learning wasn't true anyway. And I can see why that would be discouraging, but the important thing here is that we really have to get rid of the whole conventional idea of learning words and replace it with a different and more effective model. So what do I mean by this? Well, The idea of learning words in the conventional model is treated as a fact, such as a square is a figure with 4 sides and 4 corners, and the sides are of equal length. A triangle is a figure with 3 sides and 3 corners, and in an equilateral triangle, the sides are of equal length. These are straightforward pieces of information that you can just learn. Words are not like this. Words are more like people. If you're introduced to a person, you'll learn her name and you may learn a couple of other things, like what her occupation is and where she comes from. Would you say that you then know that person? I don't think you would. It's only when you've met her on several occasions under different circumstances and had conversations with her that you start to say that you know her. And the same is true of words. What you get in a dictionary or a word list or even in sample sentences is just an introduction to the word. We don't know the full range of its personality. We can't learn words from dictionaries. We can't learn words from Anki. We can only learn words from meeting them again and again in real Japanese. And that's one of the reasons why the only way you can actually learn Japanese, as opposed to learning about Japanese, is by immersion. And specifically in this case, by what we can call massive input, by getting a lot of Japanese passing through your mind. Now, this fact that words don't have exact correspondences, exact definitions for the most part, is what troubled my patron. We were actually talking about the word motsu, which we're often taught means hold or have, and that's really quite true. And what I was discussing was someone who used an expression like "Hea ni wa game o motsu," which was intended to mean I have games in my room. This, unfortunately, isn't natural Japanese because the word motsu fundamentally means hold, and by extension, it can mean have. So, if you say pen or motsu, you could mean you're holding a pen, but you could, by extension, just mean that you have a pen. You might have it in your pocket. However, saying hea ni motsu, I have in my room, is stretching the link to the English word have too far, because we've moved too far away from the original hold meaning of motsu into possessing something in a place other than the place where one is, which has really stretched the word too far. Now, this is what my patron was worrying about, so I learn a word like motsu, and then I find actually it can't be used in this or that circumstance. And this is true of lots and lots of words. So why isn't this worrying? Well, this is where we get to the question of input and output. As I say, I don't really like these words too much. So what I would prefer to say, which boils down to the same thing, is passive and active vocabulary. In language, words always enter our passive vocabulary before they enter our active vocabulary. That's to say, before we get to the stage where we can use them well in so-called output, when we speak them and write them, we have a stage where we understand them when we hear them, but we can't necessarily use them very accurately. We all see small children going through this phase, and foreign speakers of languages go through it as well. It's not anything to worry about. The only problem is that when we have this concept of learning a word, which is supposed to include the full range of the use of that word, we start to worry. We've learned motsu, but we can't use it under all circumstances. Well, that isn't a problem at all. That's just natural. How does this work in our favor? Well, once we jettison the conventional notion of learning words, we can comfortably settle into the idea that when we put words in our Anki, our SRS, or whatever, we're not trying to learn the word. We're just trying to pin it in place. So it doesn't matter if the definition is just one other word, and preferably if we know one, a Japanese other word. But the point is that whatever that definition is, whether it's a quick, short Japanese sentence, another Japanese word, an English word, it doesn't really matter, because that's not where we're learning it. That's just the tacking stitch where we pin it in place. Where we learn it is the same place where we get to know a person, that is to say, in multiple encounters, in context, in understanding what a word really is and how it really works in Japanese, as opposed to how the supposed equivalents work in English. This takes a massive burden off the learning of words. We're not trying to learn them to active vocabulary level. We're only trying to learn them to passive vocabulary level. This means that an introduction, a hint, is all we need. In our Anki, we shouldn't have long definitions on the back of our cards. We should have the briefest definitions we can get away with. We shouldn't be trying to memorize all kinds of things about the word. We should be simply pinning it in place and letting our immersion do the rest. Now, of course, sometimes one needs to use words in output. That's to say, use them actively. Now, if you need to use new words that you only just learned in output, and sometimes that happens particularly in writing, I do have a technique for that which can help you enormously and save you from using strange Eihongo, that's to say English-structured Japanese. However, that's for another video. And I'd like to add a point that I've made elsewhere, which is that I'm not suggesting that you avoid active use of Japanese so-called output for a long time. On the contrary, you should use Japanese actively whenever you get the opportunity to do so. Sometimes you'll use words wrongly, just as children sometimes use words wrongly, and foreigners in any language sometimes use words wrongly. If your partner is a conversation partner or a tutor, she may correct you, or she may not. It doesn't matter. A good conversation tutor knows that overcorrecting is not a good idea. The important thing is to keep up the flow of communication. That's the way you get the feel of Japanese. The komakai bits, the small stuff, the exact meanings, etc., that will come to you over time if you're immersing in Japanese. And if you're not immersing in Japanese, why are you worried about it anyway? So the fact that a word doesn't correspond exactly to its English equivalent is no cause for worry. And if you are worrying about it, the chances are that what you're doing, in fact, is overlearning words. You don't need to do anything more than pin words in place so long as you're immersing in Japanese. And since that's the only way to actually learn words rather than just learn about words, if you aren't immersing in Japanese, you're not going to learn them anyway. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my dear Gold Kokeshi patrons who make these videos possible, and all my dear patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. It's you who allow this revolution to happen. Thank you. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. これからもよろしくお願いします。Class dismissed.